谢谢大家回谢北北时间，我是大叔傻
我是大叔甲。
呀。我们这一集呢很有趣，我们就说大家肯定都知道，大叔有个特色就是交友复杂，所以呢，我们特别邀请到这个Malcolm Davis，他是澳洲军事专家，他现在在一个单位叫做 ASPISB，就是他是一个智库，然后他的专长，他很多专长里面，其中一个是专门讨论到所谓太空，那太空里面就包括工业啊、商业啦、军事啊、政治等等这样子。那当然，这个阿北小时候对当太空人是有想法的，所以 anyway，Malcolm 他现在当然是在澳洲，然后在之前呢，他在德国、在英国，都是专门是这一方面做了很多的这个不只是学习，然后也做了很多研究。那他自己从一个学术的角度，他专门就是在讲战略跟那个国家之间的一些关系的研究。所以呢，那个大叔讲，我们这边要请听众注意听什么东西呢？
我觉得未来那个越来越像好莱坞的当初的星际大战，所以过去都常常有种种原因是未来都很远，但是最近这几年全世界大家在致力于太空的，不管是探索或者是其他种种活动，因为它的那个制作的成本都大幅的减少，所以很希望大家能够听听说其他的国家现在都在做什么。那我们就直接进入节目喽。
Welcome back. Well, we have a special guest, Malcolm. Well, Malcolm, please say hi to everybody.
Hi, it's Dr. Malcolm Davis. I'm a senior analyst in Defence Strategy and Capability with the Australian Strategic Policy Institute in Canberra. ASPI, as it's called, is Australia's leading think tank on defence and strategic policy. And my area of focus is on space policy and space security, and more broadly, future military technology and how it impacts on the Indo-Pacific region.
Right. Great. Well, it's great to have you on the show. Being the space expert, we kind of jump right into the question. I mean, I think in the old days, when we think of NASA's and other agencies, it costs billions and billions and decades to do anything interesting. What has changed? But is it something that Australia is doing? Is it something that Taiwan should be thinking about?
Well, when you look at where space is now and you compare it back to the days of the Apollo moon program or even the shuttle program in the 80s and the 90s, I think you'll see a fundamental change in the global space sector. A lot of people call this Space 2.0. Space 1.0 obviously is the old style of government-run space agencies like NASA and the European Space Agency and so forth, doing big projects that, costing hundreds of billions of dollars to get people to the moon. Space 2.0 is where the commercial sector leads. It's where private sector goes. And so you think immediately of SpaceX and Blue Origin and other companies that are doing interesting things with space capabilities. And I think what you're seeing, the key trends are in this transition is space is getting cheaper to access and utilize for a broader range of purposes and for a broader range of actors. So space is no longer just controlled by the major superpowers. A lot of smaller states, middle powers, small powers, even non-state actors and commercial actors are now key players in space. Because it's becoming cheaper, there's more of an opportunity. So space is becoming democratized is a good way to put it. And that's really significant, because suddenly we have the opportunity where the commercial sector can really lead and innovate whilst the government space agencies kind of follow behind. A classic example of this is SpaceX planning to fly their Starship reusable launch vehicle, which will, once perfected, will launch for about $2 million per launch and be fully reusable and fly every day and deliver 150 tons of payload into low Earth orbit. In comparison, the Space 1.0 approach with NASA, with the Space Launch System, is going to cost $2 billion to launch. Will launch once per year and put the same amount of payload into space, but be fully expendable. In other words, it's not reusable at all. So two fundamentally different mindsets, two fundamentally different business models based on how new technology is being used. And this is really where space is going. It's no longer like it was in the Apollo days. It's now the commercial sectors. It's the Elon Musks and the Jeff Bezos and others that are really leading. And that's opening up space for a broader range of customers, but also a broader range of users, including countries like Australia and Taiwan.
What can you tell us what the path Australia has taken, and perhaps even South Korea? Just give us a sense of what other sort of middle power or smaller powers or even non-state actors are doing.
Yeah, well, it's very interesting. When I first joined DASPE in 2016, and I said to them, look, my area is space. I want to research on space policy and space security. They said, great, that sounds fantastic, go to it. So I went up to defense and started speaking to them about space. And the mindset was, why do we need to talk about that? The Americans give us everything we need. Okay. What? And now, that was in 2016. It's now 2021. The mindset has fundamentally changed for a number of reasons. Firstly, I think in 2017, 2018, Australia started to realize the importance of Space 2.0. They realized they too could be a player in the global space sector that is currently worth hundreds of billions of dollars and is likely to become a $4 trillion sector in 2030. They too could be a player in that big sector without breaking the budget because of Space 2.0. And so you saw in 2017 at the International Astronautical Congress in Adelaide, the announcement of the formation of an Australian space agency. That space agency was established in 2018. You saw an Australian commercial space sector that went from a few small companies to now hundreds of significant companies all doing things to the point whereby you have companies, for example, like Gilmore Space Technology on the Gold Coast in Queensland, building rockets to launch Australian satellites on Australian launch vehicles from Australian launch sites on a regular basis. You compare that change where we are now with rockets being developed, launch sites being built, satellites being built, you compare that to a few years ago where the mindset was, why do we need to talk about this? The Americans give us everything. So there's been a fundamental shift in thinking in Australia on space. We recognize how important it is. We recognize that we can access it. We can do space without horrendous cost, and we can be a key player. And I think that South Korea is doing the same thing. South Korea's commercial space sector is really taking off in the same way. And when you look around the world, you see other countries doing the same thing. So really, it's that fundamental shift from Space 1.0 to Space 2.0 that's underway. There's a further step out in the future called Space 3.0, which I'm happy to get into, which is even more exciting, but we're yet to get to that point.
Right. Well, on that point, I'm curious to hear Malcolm just in terms of this transition process. And the analogy I'm drawing is a little bit sort of, in the bad old days in the 1960s when quote unquote internet was invented, and it used to be a government project, and obviously by the 1990s there was this gigantic explosion. But if you look at a policy level, as you said, 1.2, 2.0, it went from government-led to private sector-led, but there's a lot of policy that need to be changed. So what needs to be changed when it comes to the space side?
Yeah, policy is playing catch up to the technology and the business approach. There is now a major discussion about how do you regulate and manage the commercial space actors. You've got space tourism that's starting to make some headway, and people are saying, look, all right at the moment it's joy flights for the mega rich. How do we manage it when it starts to be something real in perhaps 10 years time? How do we regulate that? How do we manage the commercial use of space in a sustainable manner? So if we're going to the moon this decade under Project Artemis, and we're going to start utilizing space resources. How do we mine the moon in a sustainable and responsible manner? The Americans have come up with this thing called the Artemis Accords, which are designed to do that. But there's a lot of diplomatic and policy discussion on how we update our approaches to space law, regulation, the management of the interface between commercial companies and state governments, on how we cope with Space 2.0, let alone Space 3.0, which is, to brief you on that, Space 3.0 is the next step in terms of building industry infrastructure and presence in orbit and on the moon to be able to enable a space-based economy.
So cool.
And so in other words, that's next big step in perhaps 10 to 15 years time.
Right. Oh, people are projecting in 10 to 15 years there will be
as I said,
moon colony.
Well, the plan is to go back to the moon this decade under Project Artemis with the Americans. Australia has already signed up to support that. I believe the Japanese are doing that as well. I'm not sure about the South Koreans, but there's broad support for Project Artemis. Chinese and the Russians have got their own approach with the International Space Research Facility on the moon. But the plan is to go to the moon this decade and to stay, rather than just doing flags and footprints missions like Apollo. They want to establish a permanent presence on the moon so that they can test technologies that will ultimately get us to Mars probably in the late 2030s, early 2040s.
Wow.
But it's that the key point there is not necessarily going to Mars. The key point is having a permanent human presence on and around the moon that then enables us to do Space 3.0, which is utilizing space resources to do all sorts of things like manufacturing and so forth, which is really exciting. That's on the horizon.
For sure. Yeah, I remember reading somewhere they're talking about manufacturing semiconductors in space, just the level of purity and its ability to do calculation, just many folds.
But when you think about what you can do with additive manufacturing and robotic assembly lines in zero gravity or microgravity environments, it really does kind of open up all sorts of interesting possibilities about unique products and unique materials that we can't do on Earth.
For sure. And I think implicitly, this is sort of in the old days is primarily thought of as a military or demonstration of national strength, but it sounded like 2.0 is really bring an entire ecosystem into commercial application and whatnot. And so I'm wondering if you could kind of give us a sense of just what's the magnitude? Because again, in the old days, it's billions and billions, and then today a CubeSat is what 10,000, a million. What are we talking about here?
Well, I think you're starting to see all sorts of potential opportunities for space to be able to do a lot broader things than just military. We're going down the path this decade of mega constellations of tens of thousands of satellites in low Earth orbit that will then enable things like the Internet of Things that will fundamentally change how we use the internet here on Earth, or pervasive Earth observation. So instead of going to Google Earth and seeing imagery that's maybe 10 days old or a month old, you see Earth as it is right now at that point. Internet in the sky, broadband in the sky, these sorts of applications for small satellites in low Earth orbit are starting to appear. And if the business case is there in terms of the number of customers taking up those services, then it makes it viable then to actually develop these sorts of capabilities, both in Earth orbit and further out in cislunar space to utilize lunar resources and so forth. So it's about making that business case, and that's where the uncertainty is. How successful, for example, will be SpaceX Starlink, which is the broadband in the sky type arrangement. We all want Internet of Things because that's going to radically change the way societies function. If you won't have self-driving cars without the Internet of Things, but and AI comes into that as well. But it's about making that business case, and if you can get the cost of those space technologies down sufficiently, then the business case is much easier. And so that's why it's really important for things like CubeSats, which you have high school students building CubeSats for well under $100,000. Small satellites costing tens of millions of dollars compared to $1 billion for a traditional large satellite. The cost comes down in terms of the actual satellites. The cost comes down in terms of launch because you're using reusable launch vehicles as opposed to expendable launch vehicles. So all your cost in terms of building the hardware is reduced because you're using the same launch vehicle over and over again. So the cost comes down overall, and that makes it more possible to do some of these advanced applications that then have an impact on Earth in terms of changing our societies and our economies. And it is this self-sustaining loop that we get into that allows us to do more and more in space.
Right. Yeah. No, I just sort of and please correct me. I'm sort of get the scale wrong, but it sounded like from to launch a meaningful CubeSat swarms, maybe it's in the order of 100 million or less end to end, and that in contrast to, let's say, the biggest, most famous company in Taiwan, TSMC, to build a new fab for them, it cost them $20 billion. So I mean, this is something that's imaginable, as opposed to before it's like, that's just not going to happen, But
you had an Indian launch vehicle a couple of years back that put up 120 CubeSats in one launch. Okay, with SpaceX Starship, which is their big reusable launch vehicle, supposedly that can put 150 tons of payload into low Earth orbit for the cost of $2 million per launch. Okay, 2 million, not 2 billion, $2 million per launch.
Wow!
So if you could put 150 tons worth of CubeSats on a single Starship at $2 million per launch, and let's say it cost you under $1 million to build each CubeSat, you're getting some idea of how much it's going to cost in the future to be able to deploy these things.
Right. No, that's truly amazing. But and I'm not asking this just to be flipping, but how are we going to deal with all this stuff in the space? I mean, how do you manage it? It's going to be like massive traffic jam, right?
That's another business, by the way.
You're right. That's another business.
Thinking like a business person.
Space traffic management is a hot area in the space sector. How do we manage all this stuff? Obviously, if we go down the path of mega constellations with tens of thousands of satellites, and Elon Musk is talking 40,000 plus satellites for Starlink, we have to manage all those satellites that are constantly whizzing around the Earth at 27,000 kilometers an hour. We don't want to see collisions creating space debris, which then generates what's known as a Kessler syndrome, where you have cascading collisions that in the end choke Earth orbit with full of space debris. So you have to somehow manage it. And I think, as you say, that's a whole new sector we have to invest in. And it could be artificial intelligence has to play a key role here in managing all of that fast moving environment. And so that's a whole new area. And I think a lot of people are trying to understand how we do that. But the problem is, and you alluded to it earlier, I think policy is playing catch up to the technology. The technology is moving ahead, and the business case is moving ahead. The policy is moving very slowly. It's particularly moving slowly in the diplomatic and the legal realm, where you go to someone like the UN Office of Outer Space Affairs, and you go to COPUOS, which is this main organization with the UN for space stability and security, and everything happens at a glacial pace. They say, we'll talk about it for 10 years to get a policy outcome. And in the meanwhile, the technology is racing ahead month by month by month. And so there's a real disconnect there that we need to solve somehow if we want to get on top of this.
Right. But, but I think on this point, it's also interesting in that even in that scenario, we're assuming everybody is playing nice. Now, if we sort of introduce the military aspect into this, I mean, how do you prevent people from cheating, first? And then what if there are some bad actors? Because, I suppose at some point, some terrorist is going to take control of a CubeSat and do something we cannot imagine what.
Well, that's certainly a possibility. And one of the areas that I focus very much on is counter space capabilities, which is that anti-satellite area. And you've got China and Russia developing some pretty sophisticated counter space capabilities, not just in terms of physical hard kill capabilities designed to strike a satellite and physically destroy it, but also soft kill capabilities that disable rather than physically destroy. So, the potential, for example, for using cyber attack on a satellite to disable it or to take it over, that either a state could do, like China, or a third-party actor operating on behalf of China could do, is always a possibility. And so there is a concern about what's known as gray zone operations in orbit, where a major state adversary could utilize third-party actors, be they state or non-state, to hijack satellites or disable satellites on their behalf and do it in the gray zone in a manner that precludes a military response. You've got both China and Russia developing jamming technologies, spoofing technologies where they feed false information to satellites, laser dazzling so they can dazzle satellites in low Earth orbit, physical interference. The Chinese just launched a satellite the other day which has a robotic arm. They claim it's for debris mitigation, but in actual fact the same system could also be applied to interfere with another nation's satellite. So all of these things are happening as we're becoming more and more dependent on space for our day-to-day lives. The mobile phone that I've got in my hand here doesn't work without GPS. So if the Chinese can somehow take down GPS, then all our mobile phones are just useless hunks of plastic.
Sure.
So this is really critical. How do we protect space? How do we defend it against aggression? Is the best way to do that through space law and through new norms of behavior against irresponsible behavior and identifying aggressive or irresponsible behavior? Or do we need to complement those laws with some sort of space deterrence whereby we can defend our satellites or we can respond against a threat if it emerges? And these are very critical issues that we need to deal with very urgently.
Sure. And because the heavy investment, it's a natural target for any sort of asymmetrical attack. I mean, for the lack of a better word, the return on capital or return on investment for these kind of attacks is humongous, right? So it's sort of a prime target, if you will, much like internet.
I urge your readers to have a look at a paper by the Center for Strategic and International Studies in Washington, D.C. called Defense Against the Dark Arts in Space.
We'll put it on the show note.
Which looks at that whole issue of the gray zone in orbit and how you respond if one of your satellites just goes dead and you can't really attribute it to enemy action, but it could be enemy action. And there's all sorts of issues there associated with insurance. How do you protect a commercial company from loss if their satellite goes dead and you're not sure? Was it hit by a piece of space debris? Was it deliberately interfered with by an ASAT or a cyber attack? Or did it just fail? And it's that uncertainty that I think is important. But it's the potential, I think, for an adversary to utilize counter space capabilities prior to or at the outset of a military conflict to disable our key military systems, to effectively leave us deaf, dumb, and blind in space is very real. And I would fully expect it in the next war. The first shots will be fired in space rather than here on Earth.
That's a good point. Instead of taking out their ground communication, just take out their satellites. So sort of turning back to Earth, again, Malcolm, like to get your perspective in terms of, Australia has just recently gotten into this whole ecosystem. So either Australian experience, or if you look at Taiwan, this is a global ecosystem. Like how do you find your niche? We can't do everything, right?
And I think it would be foolish to try and essentially reproduce NASA. That's the wrong approach. Look, I think that a country like Taiwan, for example, given it's the nature of its technological economy, would be very well placed to, for example, build small satellites. And if you wanted to launch them, you could either launch them directly from Taiwan, or as we discussed earlier, you could buy launches from a friendly country like Australia, where they launched them from Australia. But build small satellites. Start experimenting with small satellite technologies and CubeSats. Get university students and high school students building these things and putting them up there on a ride share, and experiment and see where it can take you, and explore that. And you're very well placed to do that. And you don't need to invest in everything in the global space side of things. But once you start investing in critical technologies such as CubeSats and small sats, you suddenly start to be able to do more.
Right.
So we're, for example, in Australia, we have built a number of small CubeSats which we've put up in orbit, and we're now using that experience to build more sophisticated capabilities to the point whereby we've just recently announced we're sending a rover to the moon to support Project Artemis, to basically explore lunar surface for resources. And there's another project underway called Seven Sisters, which is about sending a bunch of probes to lunar orbit to support the Artemis project. So these sorts of things can be done if you start down a certain path of investing in areas that you know you're good at. And in this case of Taiwan, it's the electronics and microelectronic components and semiconductors. You invest in those areas, and that leads you to other areas without necessarily trying to do everything at once.
Right. Now, that definitely makes sense. But along the same thought, again, having been ahead of us here in Taiwan, I mean, what would be sort of milestones that civilians like me would say, oh yeah, we actually, we were able to do this?
Well, I mean, I would start by deploying satellites into orbit, getting some satellites up there, so that they can then support Taiwan's needs. And obviously, if we're talking about low Earth orbit, it won't just be one; it'll be a series of satellites, so that there's a continuous coverage of Taiwan's maritime approaches or its airspace or what have you. But you could build, say, 10 CubeSats or say 4 or 5 small sats, place them on a launch by a friendly party. So it could be Australia, it could be Japan, it could be India, or what have you, and get them up there. And then Taiwan is making clear inroads in space. And that would be a really useful, I think, step for Taiwan to actually do without spending huge amounts of money on trying to say, all right, we're going to launch our own satellites, or we're going to have our own astronauts. I mean, Australia is not even looking at astronauts for a number of more years. So you've got to start small. That's the thing.
Oh, wait, sorry. So is Australia thinking about sending a human into space? I mean, sort of independently.
I think there's discussion in terms of the latter period of the Artemis project. Once you've got American astronauts back on the moon and they're establishing a lunar base, well, then it would be logical for us to train some of our citizens as astronauts, and they participate in lunar missions with the Americans. But the key thing is we want them to be participating as Australians, not as American citizens, because previously you had to become an American citizen to fly in space.
I understand.
We don't want that. We want Australian astronauts on the lunar surface with Aussie flags on their spacesuits.
Absolutely.
That'd be very cool. It's one of the really inspiring things for me as a true geek is when Captain Kirk went on Earth. I was very happy for that.
The Blue Origin flight. Yes.
That's right. Indeed.
So we're coming almost to an end of our program here. If I may just summarize, being a good student that I am, so your advice to people in Taiwan would be start out small, get the kids interested, let in the private sector for the commercial applications, and look for good partners.
Absolutely. Let the private sector lead. Don't have it a government top-down run program. Get some of Taiwan's best and brightest commercial actors and private sector actors in. Say, okay, here's what we want you to do. We want you to build some satellites and do something really amazing with them. And get young people involved from the outset. So in other words, get some of Taiwan's sharp young university students and high school students involved from the outset in that project, even including designing and building these things. We have sort of high school students being involved in designing CubeSats, okay? And let the private sector lead. Obviously have a space agency that kind of oversees it, but doesn't smother it with the dead hand of overregulation. And and that's how you make progress. Get runs on the board quickly.
Great. Wonderful.
Great. Very much appreciate Malcolm coming on the show today. We really learned. I think that this is an area that a lot of people are interested in, and again, knowing it doesn't cost that much money, that's definitely something that we should have more conversation on. So again, thank you for your time, and we'll be back after the. Thank you. Bye bye.
Thank you.
哇，真的很感谢 Malcolm 跟我们分享这么多有趣的，因为其实很多东西，他这么讲也没有特别的惊讶，可是当他一个很有系统的分析，就是从这个他所谓的 Space 1.0到今天的 Space 2.0，那我觉得这里面最有感觉的就是美国太空总署NASA 它是1年发射一次，然后会花大约20亿美金，然后现在的那个 SpaceX 号称可以每天发射一次，然后每天发射的价钱是200万美金。这种倍数不是一个零，这是很多零的差别。
是，而且重点是现在就已经在发生，这不是说某些专家在预测未来说未来就会很便宜，或者是未来会常常发射，现在已经在发生了。
是，对，我觉得当然啦，就是说从大市场角度，因为我就是所谓的 geek，那所以想当年，如果大家真的够老的话，就知道所谓的这个互联网 Internet，当初也是其实是美国军方就是美国政府里面的，然后它可是等到它变成是够便宜、够多的时候，就不是只有军方在用，而是各种奇奇怪怪想得到、想不到的都有在用 Internet， 所以感觉上那个 Space 2.0这个太空2.0的这件事情也是很快速的进入类似的状况这样子，所以我们才会看到所谓的 Space Tourism 就是说这个去当个游客去看个热闹就是说这件事情当然还不是那么便宜啦，可是至少是可以想象了。以前是说那我要去考 NASA 的太空人，8字没一撇儿。
你知道吗？现在当足够多有钱人或是有资源的人能够上太空作为太空旅游或者是去当观光客的话，那接下来的问题就开始。其实问题已经发生，就是说足够的人在那里挤的时候，那规则到底是什么？就是说谁能上去？那个你跟上航天一样嘛，就是说，突然那个早期人类开始在飞机的时候，当飞机已经是绝大部分或是一小撮人能够是上天空的时候，那美国的 FAA 就要出来制定规则啊。那个。最近俄罗斯是发生了什么事情？那个让大叔长要不要稍微解释一下？
是，就像那个大叔讲的，就是游戏规则这件事情，因为这是一个全新的领域，然后这个就不是美国说的算，也不是任何单一国家说的算，那这件事情就会比较麻烦。那所以我们在这一集，这个 Malcolm 他有提到，然后如果我们有一个连结，他其实就讲到大约2礼拜前，俄国要展现他在太空军事的能力，然后呢，他把一颗他自己的卫星打坏，那打坏就是他射了一个飞弹把它打掉了。那当然就是他自己的卫星呢没话讲，只是说在他把他自己的卫星打坏的当下，变成是有很多 debris， 就是很多碎片。那这个碎片，因为在太空它绕来绕去，所以这个碎片开始就是会撞到别人家的卫星，包括这个 ISS International Space Station。那这件事情搞得挺大的，因为这个差一点就 就会把 ISS 毁了。而且最妙的是 ISS 里面它固定成员好像是6个人，然后其中有2个也是那个俄国的太空人，所以就这整个是很复杂。那当然就是还是回到这个刚才讲的，就是我们还是以 Internet 作为一个例子。当他还是在美国的时候，大家反正游戏规则还比较好瞧。现在全世界你如果是网络还是怎么样，中国有中国玩法，美国有美国玩法，欧洲有他们的想法。那所以现在Malcolm 也一直在提醒说，现在比较大的问题是国家与国家之间，还有政府跟商业团体之间的一些互动。那你到底可不可以打自己的卫星？还是你要怎么通知？还是说如果你的卫星出了什么事情，或者是你的卫星被攻击了那这些东西就说不管是从法律，不管是从一个习惯上，这个将是未来在这个所谓的太空2.0里面一个很大的话题。因为这个东西没有讲清楚的话，这个游戏规则没有讲清楚的话，就很容易擦枪走火。
是啊，这个行为规范，大家要讲清楚。然后，第一个要讲清楚啦。第二就是说，那就是未来会不会有一个大家都能够接受的，就是有些国家想要走自己的路，那它是不是能够被归纳进来？那这个就我们等着瞧吧。
是，对，所以对这件事情，Malcolm 写了一个还蛮长的分析，我觉得在我们脸书上网页也有连结，也就是说，如果大家对这个话题有兴趣，很鼓励大家去看看，就是他从一个智库的角度怎么看这件事情，还有一点小深度，因为里面有些字我看不太懂。
有没有查字典？
当然，这幸好有 Google。
是。
那我想最后一个点，我觉得也是很有趣，就是说，那个时候找 Malcolm， 其中有一个原因是因为他是代表澳洲的立场。那其实我想大家也都知道，这个时间我们很多节目其实是，就是说话题重要有趣之外，我们都还是很希望从一个所谓的中型国家，例如台湾的角度来看这件事情。那所以就说我们如果去找美国专家，是美国有美国的能耐。那可是当我们听一个这个澳洲专家的时候，因为澳洲其实很多地方跟台湾就是比较属于所谓的中型国家的概念嘛。那我觉得听了 Malcolm 讲了之后，也是有点小感动。他说，他的点比较是说，这个你要现在去搞那个太空2.0，那个就是几百万几千万美金就搞得定的。那当然了，我个人我是没这个钱啦可是你想想看，那个台积电盖一个厂都是从不是100亿美金起跳，
是
那所以当台积电是100亿美金起跳的时候，你就花个1000万美金就能够射好几颗那个卫星，这个在台湾从台湾角度就可以射好几颗卫星上去，这个好励志啊！
是，就是说这个它的 cost down 的速度这么快到说现在它就是一个例如台湾的 size 或者澳洲 size 的国家就可以开始在考虑说它如何在下一个阶段2.0 甚至再往后推的这个太空竞赛里面，我们应该怎么样去定位自己？那当然我们不是一个大型国家像中国或美国啦，我们或是俄罗斯这样子，但是我相信以台湾的科技的能耐跟资金的充沛那政府就是归政府了就是说这个民间也好，就大家可以开始去不一定立刻做，但是可以开始去思考。我要是没记错好像前一阵子有台湾也有透过不一样的管道在美国有发射一些自己的卫星，然后我前一阵子也看到新闻，就是说好像台东因为比较靠南部一点，也是可以好像也是可以有几个点是可以适合发射一些，也许不一定是卫星就是比较是上太空的一些点所以这个我觉得大家还可以做一些长期的一些思考因为当然这一切的一切都在很快速的演变中但是我相信那个台湾嘛，反正高手在民间是有机会的。
对，就我觉得这件事情真的不要想太久。
对对，
就是其实
其
实听起来是都已经可以做，主要是要不要做了。那当然说要不要做这是一个考量，那这也是一个需要去想的事情。那我的想法比较是就是所谓还是回到这个比较经济学这边的说法，就是说 leapfrogging 啊。那这个故事就是说，像有一些国家想当年他们的这个家里电话线牵不好，所以后来他们直接跳到手机，所以这个所谓就是跳过去，就是说你不用从1.0开始走才能走到2.0。我觉得这个太空2.0现在听起来是有这个机会，那反而就是我们的很多，所以我们就说以台湾角度，就很多成本是不需要再去花的。我觉得这个还是那句话，我觉得非常励志。那所以我们这边呼吁，有人这个想要搞一个那个卫星俱乐部的时候，请到我们脸书上留言，我们去不管是集资还是，因为我们很明显已经认识一些专家，我们可以把事情搞定，然后呢，我们就可以发射谢北北1号上太空。
耶！而且据说是几万块美金可以搞得定的事情，对不对？
就听说啊，不知道这个事情就是要做。
所以那个就像我们讲者一样，就说你知道高手在民间，他们至少他自己在澳洲的这个说法是说，还是一个从民间的角度去推这个事情那个可能是可以，因为政府毕竟动作也比较慢，想的也比较多一点，所以就像那个大叔上讲的，大家真的不要想太多，也不要想太久，该上就上。
好，那非常感谢大家收听我们这一集跟 Malcolm 这个太空专家的讨论。那还是谢谢大家时间。然后第一个很感谢大家都会给我们一些 feedback， 然后2位大叔我们都会去这个看 feedback， 然后也很期待你们的看法。
然后呢，我们这里要谢谢我们自己的制作团队 Ariel、Hannah、Lalisa 跟 Oliver， 谢谢他们的一路相伴，还有他们的帮忙。
对，然后我们这一季的音乐是Oliver帮我们选的。那我们下个礼拜呢，也是一个很酷的话题，我们就要讨论什么叫做创新。跟那个我的以前的老长官做相关的讨论，那请大家多多期待。然后呢，最后当然还是提醒大家，如果喜欢谢北伯时间，要记得在您聆听的平台上订阅、打5颗星、按赞跟留言。
然后在这段疫情的时间，希望大家都能够照顾好自己，心有余力也照顾好身边的人。这段时间再加码那个 Omicron 已经来了，所以大家一定要平安、健康、快乐。
谢谢，拜拜，
拜拜。